All right, can everybody hear me all right? I don't know if the mic's working. All right, so good morning. Very happy to be here, although as a member of my generation and grad student, anything before noon isn't my preferred time. It's wonderful that this workshop exists, and I'm very excited that Japan's getting into the curriculum. As a middle school student, I first became interested in Japan. I read the novel Shogun, and it got me interested. I can't reread it because I'm terrified of what I would find. But I really, really enjoyed it, and it got me interested in Japanese language, Japanese history and culture, and following that, I started studying it more seriously. So I think it's great that there's going to be opportunity for people to start at an earlier age and to have even better curriculums than I did. So today I'm going to talk about the Warrior Code. Popularly, as we heard from Professor Barry, this has been a much discussed idea that supposedly governed the actions of individual samurai, demanding honor and loyalty to death. However, as we heard, this was very often not the case, and that these popular conceptions of Japanese warriors were often off the mark, to say the least. Frankly, there was no warrior code in medieval Japan. It just did not exist. I shudder to think what I would have told my 15-year-old self, that my essays on Bushido were a little bit off the mark. But in fact, in the early Kamakura period, the foundational epoch of the so-called medieval world, there were not even the family codes like Hojo so-on that Professor Barry showed us yesterday. But there was another kind of code. Of course, not all codes written by warriors are warrior codes as such. This was a legal code. Or more properly, this was a list of amendments and advisements to the classical laws borrowed from Tang China, drawn up to assist and standardize judges in their rulings. And we'll discuss the significance of this distinction later. So today I will focus largely on this code, the Goseibai Shikimoku. So by examining the Shikimoku, we can understand what exactly it was that the Bakufu, the warrior government, did and what it did not do. We can see what was important to the warrior authors and get a glimpse of how the warriors viewed themselves. And finally, we can reevaluate the popular dichotomy of warriors and aristocrats and their respective governments. So unlike vague claims of Bushido governing warrior conduct in the medieval world, the Goseibai Shikimoku was very real. It was mentioned in contemporary histories, temple records, personal diaries and correspondence, and even spawned a genre of books explaining the laws and offering legal advice to any takers. Further, from its promulgation in 1232, the code was copied thousands of times. It was initially copied and distributed to high warrior officials and judges, and eventually further copies were made and kept in warrior and aristocratic family libraries. Access to the text was critical, as the rules clarified in the Shikimoku stayed on the books for centuries. The next warrior government, the Muromachi Bakufu, adopted the Goseibai Shikimoku with extra revisions and adaptations to become their own standard for law. Even in the Edo period, after this code was no longer used as the centerpiece of the legal system, the text retained significant standing and continued to be reproduced and to circulate in great numbers as a primer at temple schools illustrating good governance. The code had lasting power because people thought it was important. So of course, the Shikimoku was not produced in a vacuum, and it was indeed the circumstances surrounding its production that, from which it can derive much of its significance. So we got into a little bit the history of the warriors with Professor Barry yesterday, and I'd like to flesh that out a little bit more, but without going too far back, because you could talk about this all day. So the warriors got their start in the late 8th century when the imperial state disbanded its army. This was an army entirely of conscripts. Professor Barry pointed to the lack of violence as one of the reasons why the imperial state would do this. While perhaps putting my own life in jeopardy, I would hazard to disagree slightly with Professor Barry and say that while I agree that there was a very low incidence of violence, the timing of this is quite telling, and that this was in the midst of continuing wars against the indigenous peoples in the Northeast, and that the conscript armies were ineffective. So I would argue that instead, the ineffectiveness of the conscript armies against more mobile and motivated forces played a significant role in switching to a more National Guard-like group of hereditary warrior families. Yes. Oh, sorry. Yes.
So my question is, so small families were having a hard time fighting with the native peoples that were living on Japan? Is that what you're saying?
So essentially the Japanese people were expanding eastward, east and northeast ultimately, and they were running across native peoples, the Ezo, Emishi, sort of precursors to the Ainu. And they increasingly were fighting with them as they were expanding, and this was a conflicting way of life. Much as the American expansion westward was agriculture expanding in traditionally hunter-gatherer areas, this leads to conflict as the agriculturalists will ruin the land for people that are trying to hunt and gather. So conflict became endemic there. And they had a conscript army, which was a large army. This is based on the Chinese system. They had public land grants, and there were a variety of taxes that people had to pay. They had to pay a land tax, which was actually quite low, but they also had to pay a corvée labor tax. They had to go work on these imperial projects, and an army tax. There was conscription. So for I think about 3 years, every adult male had to fight in the army. But these guys were untrained and unwilling. So desertion was a huge problem, and they were ineffective. They weren't good fighters. They didn't want to be there. They weren't trained. And so this just really wasn't working out. So I would argue that in part it was this ineffectiveness, and in part because a huge standing army wasn't necessary for a state with very few interstate problems. So, this wasn't China. This wasn't the barbarians on the northern border coming in and messing up the state constantly. This was border skirmishes with the northeastern hunter-gatherer people. But these hunter-gatherers had horses. They had better swords. And I noticed the question about swords yesterday as well. I'm, like Professor Barry, certainly not qualified to talk about swords, but my very strong impression is that this is when you start having the different kind of the samurai sword. You have a more curved sword, so it's more easily used from horseback, and it was at this point that the horse archer, the cavalry archer, was so important. These forces were mobile. They could attack these guys as necessary, could get there quickly, could follow them back, and this was a big shift in how wars were fought. Yes?
Are you saying the indigenous people had horses before the Japanese arrived?
So the question of when the Japanese arrived is a very tricky one. So the typical thinking, I believe, is around 400 BC, there was a mixing of people. There were already people in the Japanese archipelago. Further immigrants came from the Crimean Peninsula, and this mixture led to the Japanese people. And there may have been further influxes of immigration. And really, immigration was quite large until around 700. These people all had horses. The people before them also had horses. You can see in the grave goods from thousands of years ago statuaries of horses. So they all had them, but I would say tentatively that the native peoples in the Northeast had a more sophisticated method of fighting, that they were able to use mounted warriors more effectively than the Japanese government. And this was partly the shift. So shifting to hereditary families, sort of outsourcing the job of warriors of national defense to these hereditary families who were able to train people to ride horses, to shoot arrows from horseback. This made it more effective. Yeah?
Thinking about in terms of using the American example of Kit Carson or the Roman Crimean auxiliaries, did essentially a precursor of the Japanese National Guard at this time try to do that with, say, the Ainu, or the precursors to the Ainu?
I don't know if they brought in any as units as such, but certainly there was a significant amount of genealogical mixing on the borderlands. And that a lot of, there are some scholars that suggest that in addition to mixing, there were many people that were formerly hunter-gatherers that adopted a more agricultural lifestyle and became part of this frontier for the Japanese state. But beyond that, I don't think I'm qualified to answer. Yes?
This is not something that's ever going to move into our classroom, but I'm curious. As far as the native culture or cultures as you're talking about, because to say that it's just one is kind of an oversimplification since there were multiple that kind of eventually became known as the Ainu, correct?
Right.
So how much of this has been preserved? Because I know that we're running into that same issue in the United States as far as how much of our native languages are being preserved, the folklore, the things that get passed out from generation to generation, what essentially makes.
Based on my understanding, the Ainu is a term that comes into use much later, and that it's perhaps a different combination of peoples coming together several centuries later, perhaps in the later medieval period. So at this point, they're not technically the Ainu. They were called Ezo and Emishi, or Tsuchikuma. Tsuchikuma means ground spider. These are typically derogatory terms that the Japanese use for these other people because there's so little known about their cultures. They didn't have a system of writing, and almost nothing is preserved. There are a handful of artifacts, but I don't know much more beyond that.
Just very quickly, please. So since we started early, we actually do have ample time. I'm just wondering, would you prefer to give the whole paper and then take questions at the end, or is this okay?
This is fine. I think, like, absolutely. If you have questions about something going forward, let's deal with it now. If you have larger questions, I think I'd rather deal with that at the end.
Just to sort of follow up on your question, from what I know, there are, what, about 30,000 Ainu people in Hokkaido now, but I think very, very few of them grow up speaking the language natively. There was a, the legend, the mythology has it written down though. There was a girl in the early 20th century whose grandmother was sort of an oral storyteller or rhapsode, and she wrote down every story her grandmother told her. So
right, and there's been a very strong movement more recently, especially in Hokkaido, to preserve the cultures of the northern peoples, and they have a number of museums and scholars working on this now. But of course, earlier in the modern period, especially in Meiji, there was this huge drive for modernization, which meant unification, and a big part of that was universal education, and this meant the end of the Ainu language. They were bringing Ainu children into schools, trying to wean them of their customs and show that they could make these people civilized. And you know, the Ainu, the Okinawans, Koreans, that were on display in Japanese stalls at the World Fair, showing how they could colonize and civilize these people. So there was a considerable amount of purposeful erasure throughout most of Japanese history. But
they weren't allowed to vote until fairly recently as well, right?
Most people weren't allowed to vote until fairly recently. It was only in the 20s that there was universal male conscription. Women weren't allowed till, what, 1945, 46? It was in the post-war. So I don't know what specifically restrictions they had on the Ainu, but certainly they would not have had the rights of full citizens.
Sorry, and then I'm going to let you go. If they say Shinto is the indigenous religion, is it connected to those earlier religions then? Is there like a...
Talking about Shinto as a religion is always tricky.
Well, yeah.
I would say absolutely there are these connections, especially with these sort of prehistoric or proto-historic sun worship and shamanism. There are certainly strong connections between what was seen in later Ainu and what was happening in early Japan. What exactly they were is unclear because so much of it is dependent on regionalism. And it's not really until the modern period that you have any kind of drive to unify this into something that's discernible as a religion. And this is, again, largely in response to Western comparisons. So, you know, Shinto is the religion of Japan rather than these sort of discursive rituals and festivals that happen differently in different places. All right, so we now have hereditary warrior families taking over for the conscript army. And so these are acting as the teeth and claws of the aristocracy, the court, the state. And through this capacity, the warriors are gaining political and economic advantages. So we have taxable public land. This is the classical system borrowed from Tang China. Land is divided up, all publicly owned, and given out in parcels to people. And after receiving this land, they pay taxes of the various types I outlined previously. This system is failing. It was never implemented fully, but it is increasingly chipped away as the public land diminishes and these private estates arise and flourish. So as this continues to happen, competition for the increasingly attractive and profitable rights from these estates leads to heightened competition among the aristocrats for political power. Aristocrats and religious institutions made use of their position and prestige to protect these estates from government incursions, whether that be paying taxes, having the police come. These were totally private estates. They were often had the right of no entry, which meant the government officials were not allowed to enter their grounds. So warriors formed a critical part of this equation, as they often formed the pivotal rung just below the aristocrats, as the enforcers and overseers on the ground. Although, of course, higher level warriors were also absentee landlords just as aristocrats were. So in this system of vertical alliances, warriors were very much invested in the success of their aristocratic allies. So the competition among these vertical factions came to a head when the issue of imperial succession arose. Professor Barry talked about this a little bit yesterday in the causes of the Genpei War. I'd like to get into that in a little bit more detail to just show you the complexity and yet how small this world is. So in 1156, the retired emperor Toba dies. competition to name the next emperor and the heir to the throne was quite heated. So ultimately, Go-Shirakawa, Toba's son, one of his younger sons, ascends the throne, becomes emperor, and bypasses his younger half-brother through a separate consort, who is then made heir. Meanwhile, the son of his older brother, the former emperor Sutoku, and Toba's grandson, was the most logical choice, gets nothing. Yes?
I apologize in advance before I do this. I'm going to make a Western comparison, and that is, when I hear retired emperor, I'm slightly confused because I have this connection with this idea of the Roman Catholic Pope, and I'm thinking of things like, you know, Avignon and a bunch of people running around like, I'm the Pope, no, I'm the Pope, no, I'm the Pope, no, shut up, I'm the real Pope. How did the emperor retire? Did they have to live until they died? How could I'm just thinking like you could have a lot of the power struggles because you could say, well, he's really retired. It's like, no, he's not retired. So I'm confused, like, how did that work?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. There was a lot of ambiguity with these retired emperors, because at any time you could have as many as a half dozen of them running around with the reigning emperor still on the throne. So at this point, we're now in the 12th century. For the last about at least 250 years, no reigning emperor has actually ruled. So there hasn't been any real power in the throne for some time. It was for a while sort of usurped by the aristocratic regents. So they had two sets of regents, one that was for an underage emperor, and then they invented a new title. Both of these titles are totally illegal, or extra legal, I should say. They made these up. They're not part of the classical codes. The Fujiwara, the head aristocratic family, invents these positions. They become regent for an infant emperor, and they're able to marry into the imperial line, get their grandchildren on the throne, and then rule through them. Then they invent another title, Kanpaku, which is regent or chancellor, but it's regent for an adult emperor. So they're able to use the power of the position of the emperor without becoming emperor themselves. The power of the aristocrats is then challenged beginning in the 11th century. Typically, I think they say the beginning of the Insei period, the period of the retired emperors, starts in 1086. This is open to debate because there were retired emperors that were active previously. The retired emperors challenge this because they're retired emperors and they have a lot more authority, at least a lot more prestige than chancellors. And so there's a power struggle between the aristocrats and the retired emperors. And at this point, the retired emperors have largely won. That there's one retired emperor, typically the most senior, that will largely be in control of the court. Yeah?
So when we talk about the Japanese emperor coming from a direct lineage from ancient, are we actually sure, and I know this to a Japanese person, they probably get really upset with me, are we really sure that that's the case? Because you're saying there's about half a dozen of them running around.
Well, they're all from the same family. I think that you can say with a very high degree of certainty that there is a direct line running back to about the 6th century. It's certainly not the case that they are necessarily descended from the sun goddess, from Emperor Jimmu in 660 BC. That has no basis in historical fact. But there certainly were emperors from, or at least kingly creatures from at least the 4th century, and probably around the 6th century it started to be unified. In the 7th century you certainly have a unification into a centralized state with a direct line of descent. So from that point on you can definitely show that these are the same family, although there are those that die without heirs, and because succession is irregular, it often goes from one emperor to his younger brother, to that first emperor's son, to another uncle, to maybe a nephew, and it can jump around. There is no rule for succession. Primogeniture is never the standard, which is confusing, but I would argue is actually the point. Professor Barry got into this a little bit yesterday, that because there's no rule for it, it really weakens the imperial household. So that instead of having a strong central emperor that's able to reign and rule together, the emperor is dependent on alliances and compromises with powerful aristocrats. And because of the nature of the circumstances of the unification of the Japanese state in the 7th century, you have all these powerful aristocratic houses. Really, the imperial family is just one of these. It's the first among equals. And so you have this essentially aristocratic house coming to rule, but it really needs to heed the will of the other aristocrats. It can't rule without them. At this point, this is becoming less and less true. The retired emperor is becoming significantly more powerful. So in this case, oh, sorry, yes?
So what was the mechanism that made an emperor retire? And at what age would that be? Was it kind of like, okay, it's your turn to be emperor now, I've done it? Or what was it?
It's a really interesting question. I've often wondered about what was the driving force behind the retirements. Some of them, they choose to retire. They decide it actually is a pretty heavy load being emperor. There's a lot of ceremony and ritual you have to preside over. You're not allowed to exercise very much power. You have very restricted freedoms in some capacity, the gilded cage. But you know, life in the imperial palace is very good, certainly compared to the 99% out in the provinces. So some emperors chose to retire, and this was a savvy political move for some, because as a retired emperor you could really exercise a lot more political power. Others were forced out. So previously the Fujiwara, this aristocratic house that ran the regency, would compel the emperors, who were often grandsons of the regent, to retire so that they could install a new young emperor who'd be more pliable to their wishes. The mechanisms for retirement, I'm not entirely sure. It's certainly, as Andrea mentioned yesterday morning, it is tied in with Buddhism. There's this idea that they're the Buddhist monarchs. And so often they would take the vows of a priest, but the actual mechanism I'm not sure of. So do we have one more question?
I hope this really quick. This direct line, does this extend to the current emperor's camp?
It does.
Right.
So it's the longest running ruling house in the world, I believe. Okay, so we have the Hogan Disturbance. We have a dispute over imperial succession. There are many candidates. It's unclear which one's going to get it, but ultimately one of them does. Go Shirakawa becomes the emperor. So this is essentially a family quarrel, and it's routine. As I mentioned, there is no real rule for imperial succession by design, and it effectively splits the court. So having failed in politics, the faction led by the retired emperor Sutoku tries to take through violence what it could not get through intrigue. So encompassing the imperial family, the highest ranking aristocrats, the Fujiwara, the regents, and the most powerful warrior families, the Taira and Minamoto, pitting brothers, fathers, and sons against each other, the Hogan Disturbance brought violence to the streets of Kyoto. This, Professor Berry, as she mentioned, there's very little violence in the classical period. There is now fighting in the streets of the capital. It's very brief, and it's not very many people, but it's a significant development that you start to have warrior involvement and more violence in politics. So the victors of Hogan, so the side on the right, led by Emperor Go Shirakawa and critically involving Taira Kiyomori, who we'll hear much more about, won in the Hogan Disturbance. They were able to defeat and remove those on the other side. But only 3 years later, the victors split in a dispute over the spoils of war, again reinventing alliances and loyalties. So now the retired Emperor Go Shirakawa, he's retired. After 2 years on the throne, he retires and is now able to exercise more power. He and Taira Kiyomori, so his now top warrior, emerged victorious over Minamoto Yoshitomo and his allies. So in the following 20 years, Kiyomori is able to rise to heights never before reached by a warrior. And I really wouldn't worry about most of these names. I just wanted to show you how complex it is. You have all of, this group of like 30 people switching alliances and loyalties all the time, and you have these different factions pushing for different reforms depending on that moment. So it's a very changeable court. So the Taira under Kiyomori expand their influence greatly during this period. So they more than double their number of proprietary provinces. They have gubernatorial postings. They add to their estate portfolio. They oversee an expansive trade network with strong ties to China, and assemble a region-wide network of warriors. So they now are becoming incredibly powerful. But Kiyomori sought ever higher distinctions and eventually moved out from under the patronage of Go Shirakawa and entered politics on his own. His greatest achievement came in 1180 when he was able to elevate his own infant grandson to the throne. So he has now achieved what it took the Fujiwara about a century to do. He's able to get his grandson on the throne as emperor. This does not make other people very happy. So dissent is definitely fomenting. And there are numerous narratives on how the Taira declined. The most famous from the tale of Heike we heard already this morning. So we have the impermanence of all things. The prosperous must decline. The proud do not endure. The mighty fall at last, there is dust before the wind. We won't need to linger. I just really like this one. I think it's a neat explanation. Others instead speculate that aristocrats balked at the warrior reaching the upper echelons of the imperial government. Still others point to Go Shirakawa's personal jealousies or his own lust for power. No one really knows exactly why things shifted. We can only speculate, but I think jealousy, lust for power, these are always pretty good reasons. Most likely, the Taira fell victim to the same sort of shift in allegiances that brought them to prominence in the first place. Power became concentrated in fewer and fewer hands, and those left out grew increasingly agitated, desperate, and numerous. So Go Shirakawa and the other members of the imperial family turned on the Taira, and small pockets of rebellion in the provinces eventually spread out and united to the point of forcing the Taira out of the capital and eventually to defeat. So this was the Genpei conflict. Slide. So here are some of the battles. So the Minamoto, along with the Taira, had been the major warrior family for centuries. Both could trace their origins back to the imperial household itself. After significant success in the 11th century, these are the wars in the northeast. The Minamoto are killing it. They're doing great. They're getting a lot of rewards. Their luck turns. So many are killed in the Hogan uprising in 1156. And the last leader of the Minamoto Yoshitomo, having killed his own father in Hogan to side on the other side, is himself killed in 1159 in a dispute over the spoils of this war. Minamoto Yoritomo, who we'll get to know quite well, is the orphan son of Yoshitomo, came to lead the charge against the Taira 20 years later in the Genpei conflict. However, this description is quite misleading, as he never actually led troops himself. He wasn't much of a warrior, really. He instead preferred to use and discard his relatives. Suffice it to say, if you were related to him, you probably weren't long for this world. Yoritomo coming from the east, his cousin Yoshinaka came from the north. Within 3 years, Yoshinaka was dead. His army taken over by Yoritomo. And if you read the tale of the Heike, he has the counterexample of how you want to die as a warrior. He runs away, he falls off his horse, and he breaks his neck and drowns in a pool of mud. Of course, this isn't that different from how Yoritomo himself dies, but this, that's not put in war tales, so it's okay. So the fighting I also don't really consider to have been a war. It didn't have a clear beginning or end. It was not necessarily about the Minamoto and the Taira. It was more about local violence. This is an issue of local control, local autonomy between existing rivals that had little to do with the Minamoto or Taira. And this kind of local violence remained pervasive for decades. And countrywide violence returned only a generation later. And a lot of these local warriors, too, fighting in their own disputes, are adopting opportunistically the labels of Taira and Minamoto. So the idea of having the red versus white, the Taira and Minamoto, as this epic clash of two legendary warrior houses is a very compelling narrative, but not necessarily based on the facts. Although that is absolutely how it was presented at the time in the tale of the Heike. But just the same, out of this bloodshed, the Kamakura Bakufu emerged. Yoritomo adopts the title of shogun, and the medieval era began, or so the standard narrative goes. So Yoritomo had defeated the Taira forces and created a new organization to manage his warriors, the Bakufu. But many of the questions from before the conflict remained. What was to be the power behind the throne? How would the increasingly powerful warriors be accommodated in the estate system? Who would police these unruly warriors and keep the peace? Yoritomo accomplished a lot in his career. He became the most powerful warrior in Japan, and he established some of the important early institutions, a bureau for samurai affairs, beginnings of a land rights court, for example, and effectively forced the imperial government to reopen its own court. Yet it was not Yoritomo or his progeny that solidified the Bakufu as the driving force of politics. It was the Hojo. I have another slide. So here's Minamoto Yoritomo, although it turns out this portrait is long thought to be Minamoto Yoritomo. Probably not, but we're not sure. These are some of the Hojo crests in Kamakura. They very much put their mark on the place. So the Hojo family began as a minor branch of the Taira. Hojo Tokimasa was tasked with guarding the infant Yoritomo while he was in exile following his father's defeat in Heiji. But the two ultimately got a little too cozy, cementing an alliance with Yoritomo's marriage to Tokimasa's daughter, Masako, in 1177. Then, 3 years later, Yoritomo launched his rebellion with Hojo's support. And the Hojo went on to serve him as very faithful advisors and administrators, and Masako provided him with sons as well as advice and helped run the Bakufu after his death. She was often known as the nun shogun, which is always interesting. But then Yoritomo dies. And this is the problem. At the time of Yoritomo's death, the institutions of the Bakufu were still immature, and there was no mechanism for a smooth transfer of power. Sound familiar? No one had expected his death to come so soon. As I mentioned, he fell off his horse. What he left behind, though, were significant institutions. They were not yet strong enough to support a state. So Yoritomo had established independent organs for litigation and samurai affairs, but justice remained the prerogative of the chieftain, and Yoritomo himself often intervened in court cases and increasingly issued the death penalty for his perceived rivals. So the supposed tyranny of the Taira under Kiyomori, we know that he rose too high, he grabbed too much power. It seems to pale in comparison to this new shogunal autocracy under Yoritomo. After his death, the autocrat is gone. So in the east, local warrior families are clamoring for a return to autonomy. In Kyoto, Yoritomo had been outmaneuvered by imperial ministers and had sacrificed warrior interests in an attempt to get an imperial bride for his son. So the Bakufu, after his death, is confronted with increasing dissent among their ranks in the east and decreasing control and abilities to maneuver in the capital. So faced with these obstacles, the Hojo decided to roll the dice. So under the pretext of helping Yoritomo's heir, Yoriie, the Hojo established a council to help him rule. So this effectively allowed local warriors a say in their own government, while still allowing the Hojo to maintain control over the warrior government and restricting the 17-year-old shogun's power. Yoriie predictably fought back with the help of his in-laws. He launched a counter-coup, but before he was actually able to start this, he was discovered, forced to resign, and imprisoned. And within a year, he had been killed in captivity. The next shogun, Sanetomo, Yoriie's younger brother, Yoritomo's younger son, preferred poetry to politics, and this allowed the Hojo more room to operate. But he posed a different kind of problem as he produced no heirs. The Bakufu, then, led by the Hojo, needed the legitimacy of a court-sanctioned heir. Court-sanctioned shogun. So in 1218, the Hojo began negotiations with the court, a new retired emperor in charge, this time Gotoba, to send an imperial prince from Kyoto to Kamakura to serve as shogun. But the next year, before any arrangement could be reached, Sanetomo was assassinated. And this is the Tsurugaoka Hachiman Shrine, the bottom right here, and this is the site of his assassination. So this throws the Bakufu and the court into disarray. So using this assassination and this bold act against the natural order of things, Gotoba cancels the negotiations, refuses to send his son to Kamakura, and deals the Hojo a significant symbolic blow. They're now regents to a dead line. The Minamoto of this line no longer exist. They are now usurping the power of the Bakufu without any imperial sanction or authority. In the chaos that ensued, Hojo Yoshitoki, the new leader of the Bakufu, strengthened his grip there by eliminating the council, disbanding the council, and issuing orders in his own name. Retired Emperor Gotoba collected allies, and once again, he expands his own coalition as power concentrates in Kamakura. People are increasingly discontent, and he's able to collect a pretty diverse coalition. People that are loyal to the imperial household, aristocrats, even many warriors that had sworn their allegiance to Kamakura join up with Gotoba. But he perceived the symbolic losses of Kamakura to be a real weakness and launched a very misguided attack in 1221. The Hojo put down this attack with incredible ease. The Hogan Disturbance, as it is known, was over in a few weeks. The Hojo had fended off all challengers, perceived threats, rivals, but had still not yet left the shadow of the Genpei conflict 30 years previous. The Bakufu governance lacked predictability and regularity. Laws were customary, distinct to each estate, and unwritten. Decisions were subject to incessant reopening and inconsistent intervention at the top level. Plaintiffs of all stripes made dubious claims on land. Disorder, instability, violence were rife. The throne and many of their own supporters had openly challenged the settlement from the Genpei conflict and Bakufu authority. So the Hojo had to confront the specter of the Genpei conflict and bring stability and a close to it at last. So they began their drive for stability in Kyoto, the locus of this imperial rebellion. They established a stronger military presence in the city by establishing a new office, the Rokuhara Tandai, staffed by the the second in line to the Hojo leadership. So, and this office maintained a military presence in the city, extending the Bakufu's ability to surveil the city and its ability to project power. And additionally, the Bakufu intervened in imperial succession. So we know that imperial successions are very imperfect, to say the least. The Bakufu intervenes and causes an imperial succession by displacing the reigning emperor. They make him step down. They exile the retired emperor Gotaba and his sons, who are also retired emperors, and they elevate instead their own choice, who's a bit more pliable, and put his father in the position of retired emperor, even though he had never reigned as emperor. So the Hojo are in a very powerful position. Having defeated their rivals, can do essentially whatever they want, though questions of legitimacy are still very significant. But this meddling in the imperial succession created a very useful precedent for Bakufu authority in court affairs, and effectively ended the influence of the retired emperor, which the position of the retired emperor, which had effectively dominated court politics for about 200 years at this point. So finally, the Bakufu confiscated as many as 3,000 estates from the imperial coalition. So the Bakufu then used these estates to reward their loyal vassals, and of course confiscated estates from ones that did not follow them into battle. And the figure of 3,000 may be too high. There are those that argue it was more like 800. But even a smaller number of these confiscations provided an invaluable opportunity for the Bakufu to both compensate its faithful vassals and expand its influence. So in the period following this rebellion, over 100 jito, these are estate stewards, so warriors appointed and sent out to different estates to ensure that taxes are paid, keep order, make sure that the government's laws are respected. These estate stewards were appointed in the rebellion's immediate aftermath. However, the process of appointing these stewards posed significant problems, and in some cases these difficulties lasted for decades. So many new stewards complained that their share of the harvest wasn't enough. Others that had more familiarity with the land were less vocal, and instead illegally expanded their own authority and income. Others faced the opposite problem, as their inexperience with the land, inexperience in dealing with estates, allowed estate proprietors and cultivators to cheat them out of their tenure. So these problems led to increased caseloads for Kamakura, which now, after Jokyu, is the supreme adjudicator of the land, but it still is not yet equipped to handle the cases of the entire country. So to address these concerns, the Bakufu turned to its courts. In 1222, the Bakufu issued an edict instructing dissatisfied estate stewards to submit their complaints and relevant documents to Kamakura for judgment. But rulings proved difficult and time-consuming. The rights and limitations of each steward depended solely on the rules of his or her estate. So each estate had its different set of customary, unwritten rules that this now one court had to sift through. So the next year, the Bakufu issued a new set of written regulations for stewards, trying, at least for the newer stewards, to make a set of uniform rules. But these rules specified the share of the crop, as well as other sources of the income that the steward was guaranteed and what it limited him to. However, these directives did not stop the flood of litigation that nearly drowned Kamakura. So as a result, fairness and consistency in judicial decisions were jettisoned simply to keep the courts afloat. The conditions were untenable and threatened the long-term legitimacy of the regime. So until 1224, due process was compromised by the state of emergency, the uncertainty following the Jokyu rebellion. And following this, there's also this rise in court cases, particularly false and frivolous cases that really have no business being there, but there's no reason not to bring this to court and the chance that you might get the estate. So frequently the decisions did not look into the history of the cases or potentially conflicting rules of the estates, and often produced only cursory settlements or injunctions. So the decisions were regularly appealed, as they didn't have enough information to withstand this, and this led to repeated trials of the same case again and again, which is a waste of government time and money. So Hojo Yasutoki, the son of Yoshitoki, took over the leadership of the Hojo following his father's death in 1224. Yasutoki was able to finally achieve stability for the Bakufu through reforms and normalization of its rule. In 1225, he created the Board of Counselors, and he staffed this with hereditary bureaucrats that were experts in law that a generation before the Hojo had lured away from Kyoto. And along with these bureaucrats, he staffed it with local warrior families. So this again looks like a return to conciliar rule as they had a decade previous. However, this was not the case. Despite this appearance of conciliar rule, he actually ruled with the concurrence of the council, which is the reverse of what had happened previously. The council ruled with the concurrence of the Hojo. So this was a position similar to what Yoritomo had following his victories. The Hojo had quashed any doubts that they were the most powerful in the land, and this is a very promising opportunity for an autocrat. So he had the choice to pursue this or to nurture the budding judicial system. Of course, mercifully, he chose the judicial system and made this a centerpiece of his regime. He rigorously reformed trial procedure and judgments, revitalized the Bakufu's investigative agency, and expanded the willingness, capacity, and partiality of the Bakufu courts to find, request, and process evidence in cases. So the courts would summon witnesses from anywhere in the country and forcibly bring them to Kamakura if they had to. Settlements became more comprehensive and permanent. The courts even settled cases that had been in dispute for decades and put an end to this constant process of appeals. In these reforming efforts, Yasutoki attempted to work from consensus, adhere to reason, dori became the centerpiece of his regime, and established standards so that anyone coming to the court would know what to expect. In essence, he offered predictability and fairness, judgment based on codified rule. To apply these standards to his government, Yasutoki compiled the Goseibai Shikimoku in 1232. So the Goseibai Shikimoku literally is the list of amendments and enforcements for honorable judgments. It's a list of 51 articles explaining the laws and enforcement policies of the Kamakura Bakufu. Yasutoki commissioned it and had it sent to his brother in Kyoto, who now occupied this new powerful military post. And along with it, sent instructions for it to be disseminated to high Bakufu officials and from there throughout the country. The Shikimoku became the centerpiece of the Kamakura legal structure and gives us the best picture of what the warrior government actually did. So the articles of the Shikimoku can be roughly categorized into 6 groups: land, punishment, trials, jito, the stewards, shugo, constables, religious institutions, and social status. So I'd like to take a look at a few of these that we had in the handout that I think are representative. So Article 5, jito who detain the land tax. If an estate holder accuses a jito of detaining more than his share of the land tax, the accounts will be audited, and if the jito is found at fault, he must repay what is owed immediately or within 3 years if the sum is excessively large. If the jito goes against these provisions, he will be removed. Removed from his provision. I guess this one's short too. So Article 5 is one of the most important of the code. Stewards were sent to estates nominally to serve as their protectors. They were responsible for maintaining the law and order, but more often than not, relying on violence and intimidation. These Kamakura appointees, again there for public safety, frequently abused their power to take more than their share of taxes, infringing on the rights of estate proprietors and cultivators alike. This article, written in a way so that everyone can understand and distributed widely, made available to everyone, put clear limits on the steward's authority and promised legal action from the government if the stewards overstep these bounds. So let's consider the circumstances again. The Hojo were unchallenged militarily. They've crushed their rivals in the most decisive fashion possible. And now with the freedom to do as they wished, the opportunity to aggrandize and greatly please their vassals, they instead limit their power significantly. So the Hojo-led Bakufu stepped in to ensure that the established interests, the imperial court, aristocratic families, religious institutions, that their interests would be protected. So in this, the Hojo regime was incredibly conservative. The Bakufu was not looking to drastically alter the economic or political climate at the time, but to preserve, slightly altered, the status quo. So, do you have a question?
Yeah, so the Shikimoku was written by the Hojo?
Well, it was written under their authority. It was mostly written by these legal bureaucrats, but commissioned by the Hojo.
Okay, so my understanding, I guess I'm having a hard time understanding why the Hojo would want this to happen. The idea is that the Hojo want to be sure they're getting their fair cut from these local landowners. Is that?
So it's a very interesting question. It's in some ways counterintuitive. So a big question in pre-modern Japanese history is why don't they get rid of the emperor?
Right.
there's never any attempt to replace him. Sometimes people want to become the emperor. Other times they want to make this one retire and usurp his power, but they don't ever replace him. And it's quite interesting. I don't have a simple answer for it. I would say the Hojo here are very interested. They're very conscious of their status as usurpers. So at this point, they don't yet have a shogun. They're without a shogun. They're regents to a non-existent shogun, governing after they have fought against the retired emperors and the reigning emperor. So they're traitors, except they won. So they're not actually traitors. They're the legitimate government. But in establishing this code, they're putting limits on their own stewards, essentially offering what the imperial government couldn't. So they're able to make sure that these estates continue to produce. If warriors are causing problems, it may be that the cultivators will run away. So if you're a farmer in pre-modern Japan, you have very few options. And your best recourse is to just leave if the taxes are too high, if they're treating you too poorly. And if you have violence on the estates, I do think that there was a bit more violence than Professor Berry perhaps implied. I don't think there was any kind of large-scale warfare, but there were a lot of land disputes, and there would be these small bands of warriors on estates. They would fight with neighboring estates about borders and who got what share of these hinterlands and who got to fish here. And if this violence is pervasive enough, people would leave. And so it was really important that the Hojo could guarantee that their vassals, these warriors upon these estates, would maintain peace rather than be agents against it. That they can make sure that these incomes continue to flow to the warriors as well as to the capital. And so this provided them with significant legitimacy, I think. So they were now protectors. They were helping the state. They were helping these established interests. And although they were restricting the warriors here, they were still guaranteeing them an income. And actually, helping these established interests was quite pivotal to their continued legitimacy and standing as part of the government. But of course, keeping the warriors happy was very important as well. And following this law code over the following 100 years of Hojo rule, they added amendments to it, about 200, I would say. And these often increased warrior authority and income. And these helped keep them happy. Yes?
In continuity going forward from here, I suppose that, and I know you're going to get there, but actually, let me save this question because I think you're going to go exactly where I'm thinking.
All right, I like it. Yes.
When I was reading this, I made a little comment on the side, like this is very forgiving. Like they've been cheating, right? But okay, as long as you pay us back and you got 3 years, and if not, we're going to ask you.
Yeah, it's not highly punitive.
Because the warriors could then rise up against them if it was.
It is. So the Hojo have to walk a very thin line here.
Yeah.
So they have, on the one hand, they need to keep these people in Kyoto happy. They need to keep the estates producing. They've already had one rebellion, and although they could quash another one, it's not in their interest to have this happen. The other hand, they're the warrior government. They need to keep the warriors happy, and they need to keep them in check. So they want to make sure that they keep producing and don't infringe too much on these absentee landlords. But at the same time, they don't want to be too harsh on the warriors, or they'll have another more serious rebellion on their hands. But it's interesting. I think they're very conservative and very soft with a lot of these provisions. Okay, so much of this conservative streak, I think, can be traced to their position as usurpers. They needed legitimacy from that they got from the imperial government. They needed to keep the warriors happy, so they walked this fine line. They also really wanted to suppress disorder and any causes of disorder, because this could mess up their very fragile economic system and their very fragile hold on power in some respects, in terms of legitimacy at least. So land disputes had always been a major threat. So we have Article 23, it's the adoption of heirs by women. So although it is not allowed by the ancient imperial law, since the time of Yoritomo to the present, it has consistently been the rule to allow childless widows to adopt heirs and transmit their deceased husband's fief to him. Not only that, this is the practice across much of the country. After conference and discussion, this practice has been recognized. So Article 23 is often cited as evidence of some kind of Hojo progressivism in terms of women's rights. Well, it's certainly true that the Bakufu allowed for women to hold land, to hold position. There were many female jito. There's even a diary of a woman that went across the country to go to Kamakura's courts. Just shows that women were allowed in there and that the courts were really sought after. They were really good courts. So it allowed women to take over these holdings, even to adopt an heir if necessary. But I'm inclined to believe that the Hojo were more concerned with establishing clear-cut rules for succession and inheritance than fighting for women's rights. So by establishing these standards and unifying court decisions across the country, the Bakufu effectively cut down on inheritance disputes and cases that occasionally overwhelmed the courts. This also reduced the likelihood for bloodshed and disorder that so often accompanied these disputes. So Article 8 establishes a statute of limitations on land disputes. So fiefs that, despite holding its title, have not been in one's possession for years. If more than 20 years have passed since the holder of a fief came into possession, in accordance with the precedents of Yoritomo, there will not be judgments or revisions to his claim. Even if another claims possession with a title, it will not be recognized. So this is pretty significant. Even if they have a title, no good. So in legislating, the article here finally put issues stemming from the Genpei conflict to rest. So any land disputes dealing with the end of the Genpei War, so at 1185, 1190, there's a lot of chaos. There's still fighting going on into the early 1190s. There are a lot of disputes. People are getting put onto new land, new estates, and sometimes there are mistakes made. They're sent to someone else's estate that was still loyal to Kamakura, and there are crossed wires. No more. The court will no longer hear these. If people have had the possession of the estate, that's good enough. So this clearly indicates the Bakufu's intention to move on from the conflict, as well as to reduce the number of disputes there following court cases and disorder. So again, this is more or less trying to preserve the status quo from the end of the Genpei conflict. So Article 12 aims to suppress yet another cause of disorder, abusive language. So the sources of murderous disputes lie in abusive language. In grave cases, the offender will be exiled. In minor cases, the offender will be ordered into confinement. If in a trial a litigant gives vent to such abusive language, the land in dispute will be awarded to the other party. However, if the other party is without right, another holding of the offender will be confiscated. If he has no holding, he will be exiled. So in legislating something seemingly trivial as vocabulary, the Bakufu's commitment to preserving peace and order is pretty clear. So if even words can pose a threat to stability, the Bakufu was prepared to regulate them. So finally, the Shikimoku sought to ensure due process and a fair trial. So Article 30, sending letters to powerful families rather than awaiting the judgment of court. In such cases, the winner exults in the strength of his powerful connections, while the loser laments the influence of those in power. Hence, the winner will vaunt his obligation to his powerful patrons, and the loser will secretly distrust the judgments of the courts. It is in this way that the administration of the government is polluted. Henceforth, this must stop. Litigants must have access to the magistrate or otherwise directly to the court itself. Seems simple enough. So Article 30 is one of several governing legal procedure. It strives to guarantee reliable and impartial justice. This is central to the Bakufu's legitimacy and Hojo Yatsutoki's drive for good governance. These points are underscored in the oath that the Board of Counselors signed when they sealed the code. So the oath reinforces the Bakufu's policy of standardization and impartiality. The oath is considerably longer. It's in English a couple pages. This is just a quick selection. So determination of judgment by the council. If we do not stray from reason, it is our collective justice. If a mistake is made and an injustice occurs, it is our collective mistakes. We will make judgment as though one man. This is the reason for these articles. So although it's not technically an article, the oath is perhaps the most significant portion of the Shikimoku. By mandating solidarity in its rulings, the Bakufu effectively established a standardized set of rules to preserve stability and order following a turbulent half-century. So looking at these articles gives us an idea of the role of the Bakufu. Continuing in the footsteps of their classical predecessors, warriors under the Bakufu carried out the peacekeeping and policing duties of the state. The Bakufu appointed constables, shugo, to defend and police provinces, and stewards, jito, to keep the estates peaceful and productive. Yet the Goseibai Shikimoku provides insight into what the Hojo thought most important in their administration. Not only were the articles clearly of great interest to their compilers, but they reflected 50 years of governing experience as well. Well, warrior governing experience at least. Under the Hojo, the Bakufu placed special emphasis on the maintenance of order and regulated aspects of warrior life to reduce the likelihood of disorder or violence. The Bakufu laid strict prohibitions on inflammatory conduct, set standards for inheritance and other matters of land, clearly defined and limited the rights and responsibilities of its appointees. Further, the Bakufu made running an impartial, standard, efficient judiciary a top priority. The Shikimoku not only spelled out the rights and responsibilities of the warriors, but made this information available publicly and guaranteed access to the courts and fair treatment within them. The Shikimoku makes quite clear what the duties of the Bakufu were: to police the police and ensure order and a just judicial system. But the omissions in the code are equally telling. What wasn't the job of the Bakufu? Again, the Bakufu in a position of power largely set its own limits. The Shikimoku applied across the archipelago, but it only applied to warriors. Estate proprietors and even cultivators could bring suit against warriors appointed to their estate, but those with grievances against proprietors or other non-warriors had to go to the imperial courts in Kyoto. The Bakufu courts consistently turned such cases away as outside of their jurisdiction. So the Bakufu's laws only applied to a small fraction of society. Again, we're talking about less than 1%. What else did the Bakufu not do? There is no mention of foreign relations, management of currency, land surveys, or prohibitions on weapons or religions, all of which eventually fell under the authority of later warrior governments. So these are the Mongol walls they built for the second invasion. This is about 50 years after the Goseibai Shikimoku is thought. So national defense, not in the job description for the Bakufu at this point. Excuse me?
That's totally
Yeah. So this section up here is rebuilt to show what it looked like. This section is the ruins of what's left. And this is about how high it was on the backside. This is going to stop the Mongols.
How many feet is that? We're like 6, 7 feet?
On the front side of it, it's about 10 feet, I think. And the backside, maybe 4.
Mongol horses are kind of short.
Yeah, and they didn't have as many horses as they normally would have. And you can't argue with success. With the help of some very forgiving weather patterns, the Japanese were able to stave off invasion. So what does it say about the nature of the so-called warrior government? Was it in fact somehow separate? Was Kamakura Japan a diarchy, a state with 2 governments? So based on the legal code of the Kamakura Bakufu, the Goseibai Shikimoku, it is clear that it was not. The Bakufu did take on responsibilities and powers befitting a state, but this was nothing new. Warriors had been serving as the teeth and claws of the state for centuries. Further, despite the bloodletting between forces headed by the Hojo and the retired emperor, the Bakufu was not out to eliminate the imperial state, and vice versa. Even retired Emperor Go-Toba himself was very clear that his goal in fighting against the Bakufu was to remove the Hojo and not the institution itself. Rather than diarchy or competition between imperial and warrior governments, based on my research of the warrior legal code, I tentatively conclude that the warrior government existed only as a subset of the imperial government, a new agency added to take over responsibilities that the imperial government was no longer able to fulfill. The Bakufu clearly had interests, clearly had the interests of the state and the older established interests in mind when it compiled the Shikimoku. The Bakufu never acted to replace or destroy the imperial government. In many instances, it even strengthened it. Rather than a dramatic rupture, the establishment and early growth of the Bakufu was a gradual process of governmental evolution and expansion, with new responsibilities primarily falling to the warriors. So what are the warriors themselves? Were they somehow an altogether different category of men, distinct from the aristocrats in the capital? Again, I conclude that they were not. So instead, I would suggest that while they were no doubt distinguished from their civilian counterparts, they were only another breed of aristocrats rather than a different species. So warriors held tremendous respect for the trappings of the aristocracy, the clothes, poems, titles, and ranks. So not only did the warriors aspire to these, but they very much considered themselves to be a part of these. So as Professor Barry mentioned, the leading warriors had aristocratic and or imperial bloodlines. They married aristocratic women. They had themselves portrayed as aristocrats in their portraits. And here I have a little guessing game. So which one of these, one or more, are warriors? So 2 of them are warriors. So this is the Minamoto Yoritomo portrait that we saw before. And here's Taira Shigemori. He is the son of Taira Kitamori, who's a significant warrior who was killed in Genpei. So those are the only 2 warriors. This is a Fujiwara, the house of the regents, who is the top of the aristocracy. And the 2 over here are Emperor Sutoku, who we know from the Hogan Disturbance, and Emperor Go-Toba from the Jokyu Disturbance. So I guess they get to have other colored robes. But warriors and aristocrats, it's impossible to tell the difference. So furthermore, warriors were not anxious to lose this position as aristocrats, and instead aggressively asserted their aristocratic worth. So they consistently preferred imperial civil titles to the military alternatives, such as they were. There weren't as many military titles. This is quite distinct from Western history, where you have a rich array of military titles. And all the signatories of the Shikimoku signed with their imperial titles. They all signed with civil titles. And in the selection Andrea read earlier from the Tale of the Heike, we talked about Taira no Ason Kiyomori. So Ason is a civil title. So even Kiyomori, the top of the earlier warriors, uses his civil title. Aristocrats also, I'm sorry, I have one more example. The shogun Sanetomo, the last Minamoto shogun, sacrificed warrior interests actively. He went to Kyoto to compromise the position of the Bakufu in the hopes of getting his poetry included in an imperial anthology. This is the shogun. So aristocrats also, for their part, didn't seem to mind the association with warriors either, provided it didn't diminish their political or economic clout. They were not so happy having warriors appointed to their estates unless they could get more money out of them. So on top of that, all the shoguns after Sanetomo are aristocrats. They're brought in from Kyoto. They're Fujiwara. So then this is true for the rest of the Kamakura period until the Ashikaga take over. So if the Bakufu was not a new government then, the warriors were just new aristocrats, what is the significance of the rise of the Bakufu? Why is its establishment typically heralded as the beginning of the medieval era? It's significant because this was the beginning of a long expansion of warrior power. Warriors were the dominant political force for the next 700 years, and not just as military strongmen, but as politicians in their own right. It is significant because it was the first time the government transitioned from pure exploitation, taking taxes and providing nothing in return, to actually putting those tax dollars, if you will, to work. So inspired by the 17-article constitution, so the Shikimoku is 51 articles, which is 3 times 17, the Bakufu legitimately tried to govern justly, even if some scholars suggest that Shotoku didn't exist. Consciousness of the 17-article constitution was clearly quite real. It provided peace, order, justice, and established a set of defined, standardized legal rights. That this change is so recognizable to us now is really significant. In parts of the world, this still hasn't happened. But ultimately, whether or not this marks the beginning of the medieval, or if the medieval itself even exists, is open to interpretation, as history tends to be, which seems to be a recurring theme. So the process of warrior rule was quite slow. It was gradual change rather than rupture. It took about 50 years for the Bakufu to stabilize and its institutions to mature. And the resulting warrior government was not separate from the existing imperial government, nor were warriors meaningfully different from aristocrats. The beginnings of warrior rule, thus, may not have been as definitive or exciting as portrayed in the standard periodization or narrative, but their significance is quite clear. Questions? Yes.
The stewards, were they Jito?
Jito.
Jito. Now, were these former warriors, or were they bureaucrats from the start?
Technically, they are active warriors. They are all warriors, but it depends on the Jito. Some would actually go to the estate and would police on the ground. I'd say probably the majority were on the estate, but others were absentee. And for instance, these widows of Jito that were exercising the authority of Jito were rarely on the estate, but could manage it as absentee, essentially absentee landlords, although they didn't have the land rights that a proprietor would have. They could use agents in their stead to do it. Often Jito would have their own small band of lower-ranking warriors to help them out on the estate. Sorry, was that a follow-up?
Yeah, so it was the Bakufu?
Was it a Bakufu?
Bakufu. It kind of sounds like the mafia. Like, we're not going to come and directly lord over you, but we're always going to have the threat. And where is that not accurate?
Yeah, I'd say in some ways it's something of a shadowy organization that runs essentially a protection racket, that these warriors get sent to the estates to keep order, and you pay them off with a certain percentage, and they will eventually push for more and more. The other hand, it's the government. That's kind of what they do. So I'd say that they eventually have more transparency. They do this legal code. They try to restrain the rights and outline the duties of the warriors. And actually, this code is quite problematic for the warriors. They get taken to court all the time. So the aristocrats, the estate proprietors, have a copy of this in their libraries. So they can look through the rules and look for violations. And even if there aren't any, they can take them to court anyway, because the Kamakura courts only have power over warriors. There can be no finding really against the aristocrats for bringing a false suit. So they'd have to take that to Kyoto to have any punitive action taken. Yes?
Sorry, just to follow up briefly. I think that's actually a very apposite comparison between mafia and bakufu. There's a famous 20th century sociologist named Charles Tilly had a big theory about the formation and development of states. He said that kind of typologically, states and organized crime syndicates have lots of structural parallels. That effectively, if you kind of peel away the layers of the rhetoric and imagery, they both function largely as protection records.
Yeah.
Yeah, indeed, you have ties of personal loyalty. You have to swear your allegiance. You have to go out and fight. But I do think that the Hojo government, although there is very much this sort of mafia-style rule, they go a little bit beyond that because they're actually, their protection goes beyond just that estate, and they keep the realm largely at peace. With the exception of the Mongol invasions after Goseibai Shikimoku, I don't believe there is a single act of large-scale violence until the government's overthrown. Yes?
So it seems with the Shikimoku, things are going fairly well. There's a system of laws being codified. So what leads to the Kamakura falling to the Ashikaga? And then once the Ashikaga kind of stabilized that power, how much of the Shikimoku progresses into that next shogunate?
So I think that there are numerous causes for the fall of the Kamakura shogunate. It's often seen as tied to the invasions from the Mongols. So, for instance, in the Genpei Wars and the Jokyu Rebellion, you have domestic infighting. And so after the winning side wins, they can take the land from the other side. So I mentioned these estates confiscated. So they can use that to reward their followers. But when the Mongols come, there's nothing to take. And so vassals are upset that they're not getting rewarded. And this begins a process of more alienation of the vassals with the government. And increasingly, they have more and more local power. They keep infringing on the rights of the estate proprietors and the cultivators, and they're becoming more powerful, more separate from Kamakura control. On top of that, there are economic factors. Apparently, inflation was a significant problem. The government had no plans to deal with the economy except to keep the estates producing, and so there was increasing warrior poverty, so they tried to keep taking more and more. But effectively, it was an emperor who led the charge against the Bakufu, the Emperor Go-Daigo, who wanted to have a return to classical imperial rule, which, as I mentioned, almost never happens that an emperor actually reigns and rules, but he had it in his mind that this is how the state should be run. He recruits several very prominent warrior families, including the Ashikaga, who eventually become the next shogun, to support his cause, and he overthrows the Bakufu. But his reign only lasts 3 years. He gets thrown out by the Ashikaga, his main supporters, in turn on him and set up a new warrior government. So, and on top of that, in terms of the legal code, the Ashikaga largely take the Goseibai Shikimoku as it is. They also have the Suikaho, which are the amendments. There are a couple hundreds of these, and the Ashikaga add more amendments. So when I talk about government expansion, you have these more and more people are taking cases to government courts, to Kamakura courts. And by the process of going to court, they're adding to government authority. So they're hoping that they can get some dispute resolved, say, with a non-warrior neighbor. And so that then expands the warrior government's authority to deal with such issues if they take on the case. And similarly, issues of national defense come up when the Mongols come. The Bakufu heads this. Eventually, they deal with religion under Hideyoshi, with land surveys. Warrior power is, of course, greatly expanded in the 16th century when the central government more or less ceases to function. But I think it's the beginning of an expansion of warrior power and warrior government, which is ratcheted up under the Muromachi Bakufu, although their effective reach is less. Yes?
A couple of the slides use the term possession, and I'm assuming this is absentee landowner sorts of things. Who's actually living on these estates? So
the estate system, I'm loath to call it a system because it's certainly, you can't really call it feudal either. It's very close to both of those things, but it's not. I don't think I can hazard a very careful explanation of it, but essentially you have land, was formerly public land, but has been granted by imperial writ or by a top aristocrat or to a religious institution, is now tax exempt. And so you have a powerful patron in the capital that will keep taxmen out, often keep policemen out as well. Below that, they would have warriors voluntarily or their own enforcers to keep law. After Kamakura comes in, many estates, though not all, will have jito on them. And these jito are also taking a cut, keeping this in. And so they have not really possession of the land, but possession of a certain right. So you have these different rights. So on the land itself are cultivators, and they have cultivation rights. So they grow the crops, and they give however many % away. Actually, the land tax was quite low, but as these estates progressed and the central government weakened, the amount they had to surrender grew higher and higher. Of course, also yields grew. So you have cultivators with their rights. You have jito. With jito, the rights are called shiki, like shikimoku, but a different shiki, which is nice and easy. So the jito have their own set of rights, so they're allowed to exploit the estate in to the tune of a certain percentage. And then you have the estate proprietors, and then the proprietor rights can be split into many different ones, as can the cultivators. They can be exchanged. They can be sold. Jito rights at first can't be exchanged or sold, but this comes to happen illegally anyway, because the central government, the Bakufu, aren't capable of truly exerting this kind of influence in the provinces. But yeah, possession for the proprietors is almost entirely absentee. Later on, as the estates get effectively taken over by warriors, even aristocrats from the capital will go out to their estates to make sure they get their dues, because this is their source of income. As it is at this point, they're still in the capital, participating in some intrigue, writing some poems, what have you, but the money's coming in. But later on, this starts to dry up and they have to go out onto the land themselves. But mostly, yes, absentee, I think. Yes?
I just had a follow-up question to that. So did I hear you say that this elite is like 1% and everybody else is 99?
Less than 1%.
Okay.
So I don't know exactly what the figures would be. I know in High Heian, so around 1,000, the aristocrats were about 1/10%. Okay. And the warriors were a bit larger than that, but certainly less than 1%. Yes?
So you started research for, I'm assuming, your thesis?
Probably.
Okay. What have you found most surprising? What knocked you upside the head? You had essentially what we had yesterday with Professor Perry moment. We were like, whoa, that completely shifted the way that I looked at it. When did you get smacked upside the head?
I think when I was just beginning to do my research on this, I guess before I even officially made this a project, I was in a seminar with Professor Barry, who is a nice way of presenting me with information and not telling me what she thinks so that I can say what I think and then the hammer comes down. It's a really effective way to teach a class, though, because I can't agree with anyone. I have to come up with my own interpretation. Anyway, she gave us this set of documents, the Goseibai Shikimoku, and a number of other things, court cases from Kamakura. And what was really interesting to me was that I had in my head that this is a warrior government. They came in at the point of a sword. They're going to take everything they can. They're going to have a plan for what they want to do. They're going to set up this government. But really, there wasn't a plan. It's all done very piecemeal. So Yoritomo, when he starts his rebellion, just wants to have a little piece of land in the east that he can govern himself free of influence from the capital. And then that little piece of land expands to 7 provinces. And then it expands to the entire eastern half of the country. And then he forces the Taira out of the capital, and then he decides he can pursue them across the country and get rid of them altogether. And then he has this Bakufu that just manages the east. And then they convince him to expand his authority again. And I think just that there was no central planning and it just sort of expands to fill this vacuum was really surprising. But then on top of that, when you read the Goseibai Shikimoku, the bladder of the Bakufu has inflated to the point of expanding every space it could. And then it shrinks. It cuts back its own authority willingly, which I think is really interesting. And it goes back to this idea that there's never really a challenge to the central state. No one ever wants to get rid of it. No one wants to get rid of the imperial system. And I don't have a really good answer for it. I just think it's a really interesting question. And when I first realized that, it was something of a shock. Although not on par from when I went from my high school Japanese history to college Japanese history and found out that Bushido probably didn't exist. That was shocking. Yes, okay, first.
Looking at what's going on with the land and switching and looking at how small percent, or maybe even less than a percent of the population actually is having a significant amount of power. Taking a look at farmers effectively just walking away. Is there any documentation of large-scale peasant rebellion? Because I have a feeling that if, land is, there's so little of it, it's of such high value, and you have a lot of people who, for lack of a better word, can swing a shovel if they get upset. Do any documents like that exist?
Not to my knowledge for this period. There are times, certainly later, especially the 15th and 16th centuries, where the central authority is less, that peasants actually fought back. They would sometimes form autonomous peasant communities that would have their own militia. The city of Sakai, for instance, is this mercantile capital, and it was totally free of warrior influence. There was a council of successful merchants who ran the community. They had a thriving trade with Europeans. They dealt a lot in gunpowder. So they had significant military clout despite not being ruled by the warriors. Other times when warriors would try to invade another province, the peasants would unite against them to try to cast them out. But I think more often than not, it was peaceful protests, that if they were on an estate, they would appeal to the estate proprietor. That's why he's there, to keep these other guys off their back. That even later, they petitioned to the central government. They petitioned to Kamakura to try to get a fair shake. Or, again, in sort of a last-ditch effort, they can just leave. And there are documents showing that that happens, but it's hard to get documentation on the peasants because most of them don't write. Yes?
Was there ever shared ownership of estates where, like you talked about these absentees, so there'd be several claims?
Well, so the idea of ownership is still tricky because technically it's still public land. It just isn't taxed or enforced by the government. But in terms of absentee rights, absolutely. They could split the rights. They could split the estate in half. Inheritance issues with noble families, warrior families, both were significant problems here. And you could have different levels of authority. So if I'm a low-level aristocrat and I have this estate, I'm worried that I might not have the political clout to keep it protected and to keep it mine. So I could commend a portion of my rights up to a more powerful aristocrat or to a religious institution to ensure that the estate continues to be protected from government incursions, while paying for this with a percentage of what I get out of the original percentage.
Something's better than nothing.
It is, and especially as the warriors and local warriors in particular take more control, take more of the yield. Something's a lot better than nothing. Yes.
I want to go back to the horses. So is it thought because I always heard that horses originally came from Mongolia. So does this mean that there were immigrations from Mongolia way early on?
Almost certainly, yes. There's still debate about where the Japanese people came from, but it seems that at different times there were different patterns of immigration, largely from three ways: down through Hokkaido from the north, across the Korean peninsula into the southwest, and up through the chains of islands from Southeast Asia in the south.
Yeah, and I think horses in particular are thought to have come by way of Korea. But again, certainly originally from Mongolia.
There was a theory now discredited called horse rider theory, that in the 5th century that these horse riding peoples came in from the continent and took over, and that's when you see these bigger tombs, when you see more martial objects in the tombs, and something of a centralization of government. This is discredited because this happened over a long period of time. There are far too many tombs over far too long of a period for this to be one invasion, but it was clear that there were increasingly people riding horses in a military capacity. Yes?
You were to simplify medieval Japan. Down to a 12-year-old level. What would you focus on? I'm going to ask this question for everybody.
Yeah, no, I sat in the back in horror yesterday as Professor Berry had this question, what would you teach at a 7th grade level? And I'm inclined to go to the old standby of like, well, why is history important? Because it teaches critical thinking, it teaches you different ways of looking at it. So I think it's not necessarily a bad thing to present the narrative of Bushido. if I can take a slight tangent to go back to what Professor Berry was talking about yesterday, I think the idea of Bushido had a tremendous influence in the 20th century, certainly on Westerners and Japanese populations, soldiers, but it has no basis in historical fact, but people thought it did. And this is really significant. And so I think like bringing up Bushido is not a bad idea at all, but to look at it from a different angle rather than saying, you know, this was the code of warriors, they all obeyed this code, to say, well, look, here's another document, you know, or you can look at Hojo so on. They're not so worried about this code when there's warfare, when there's something else going on, and that it's not just about the military with samurai. They're also politicians, they're lawmakers, they're, you know, in some cases farmers. There's more than one story to it, and that with the, you know, this set of evidence, you can come up with different interpretations. And you know, well, I'm certainly close to saying that the Bushido in the medieval period is just outright wrong. There really isn't a wrong answer in this kind of interpretive history. Certainly, if you can have some evidence to back it up. So I guess if I were teaching 12-year-olds Japanese history, I would just try to present warriors as a new kind of government official. That, you know, they come in on their horses, but they get off. They pick up a pen and they do this, well, a brush. Sorry?
I was just making a connection, the whole idea of poet warrior. And
Yeah.
I guess it is a little bit romantic. I mean, maybe they are bureaucrats, and maybe they are potentially, you know,
Right.
dull and boring. You wouldn't want to sit and have dinner conversation with them, but the poet warrior.
Yeah, and this goes back to the idea of bun and bu and the distinction between aristocrat and warrior. That, you know, I think that that distinction is really blurred at best, especially at the highest levels. That these are aristocrats with helmets on. These guys, you know, knew their way around a poem. They were included in imperial anthologies. They were, in many cases, deeply religious, well-read. They kept private libraries. They wrote legal codes. But, you know, of course, lower-level warriors were not literate. They were not interested in poetry, although many of them were interested in linked verse later, which is, I suppose, a type of poetry. That, you know, this is a very logocentric society, so people are always quite interested in what's going on the page. But these are, you know, to paraphrase Professor Berry, these are soldiers. Their job is to kill people. So there's definitely a martial side to it. But early enough in Kamakura, that doesn't happen very much. Even with these violent sort of interregnums, there's not a whole lot of bloodshed. So that, you know, these are, certainly compared to later warriors, a more refined variety. Yeah.
So you were saying that, you know, and I like this picture, I think it's spot the, you know, the warrior, but was there a backlash? Did aristocrats, they wanted to be aristocrats, but did aristocrats accept them as, because were they, is that the reason that there were the two separate court systems? Because you had to have a special for these military aristocrats?
Well, I think, so I'll try to answer that in two parts. I think there was a separate government, if you can call it that. I use the term warrior government because it's very convenient and easy to understand, but really I think it's just a branch of the existing government, and that they established it because the central government had failed in these responsibilities. It couldn't keep the order, it couldn't keep the peace, it couldn't keep the states producing, so it needed to have a new branch. And the warriors built that, and they went there because it was a more effective one. You could get a lot more done in the Bakufu than you could in the central government. I think there is just absolutely backlash against the warriors from the aristocrats. That, for instance, the Minamoto, after the Hogan but before the Heiji uprisings, one of the Minamoto tried to marry into the Fujiwara and was rebuffed. He said that he was too countrified, he was a bumpkin, he would have no part of him and his family. And it, you know, it was part of the reason. I would say that economic and political certainties were more important, but part of the reason that the Minamoto rebelled against this, the emerging coalition after their initial victory. Shoot, I've lost track. What was the other part of the question?
Well, just that I'm just wondering, like, how this is kind of functioning as, like, maybe social mobility and seeing that and incorporating that in this time period as well.
There's certainly a degree of social mobility, more among the warriors, but I think, like aristocratic society, much of it's dictated by birth. That the most upwardly mobile places would be with, like, the hereditary bureaucrats are hereditary, but you can break into that and you can rise up through knowledge of the system. And if you're, you know, a very competent warrior administrator, you're able to rise. But in terms of the central government, it is almost entirely by birth. Yes.
going from your high school experience and what we were experiencing yesterday about Bushido and how really the idea that didn't develop until 1800s and then disastrously glorified in the 20th century. The idea of seppuku, that the ritual suicide, is that also something that really only is glorified or really gets focused on in the 19th century, or was that something that was actually quite prevalent during the time period that we're looking at?
It certainly existed, but it was typically a last resort rather than being captured and tortured, perhaps, that one could kill themselves. And these aren't necessarily warriors with honor. The main mode of getting rid of other warriors, in the Hogan Rebellion, for instance, they went to a guy's house at night, lit it on fire, and waited outside with archers for him to come running out. So this, as much as you have the nanori, the name announcing before battle in Genpei, in the Tale of Heike at least, there's not necessarily this code of conduct that says you have to kill yourself, you have to fight during the day or honorably. But there is seppuku. I don't know how ritualized it would have been, but there's certainly acts of suicide. That is in the Tale of Heike. There's suicide, although in a different fashion. I think when it becomes popularized is when it's a period of peace. That there is more of it during perhaps during the period of a country at war, but certainly the height of it must be the 47 Ronin that we talked about yesterday, when they're forced to commit suicide after avenging the slight put onto their master for being an idiot. And from that it just gets more romanticized. But it's easier to romanticize the martial when you're at peace. And so I think that it's really the Edo period that you see this sort of romanticization of warrior culture. Andrew?
Yeah, I mean, I've been reading the Heike, and there's a lot of people killing themselves. But they do it by a whole variety of means. Drowning, especially at the end of Dando Oro, was very popular.
Yeah, and it's very gender specific as well.
Yeah. So it's definitely nowhere near as formalized and ritualized as it became. As the whole the word seppuku conveys this whole set of associations. There's no such thing.
So a Taira woman, for instance, that we were talking about drowning, took the infant, the toddler emperor, the grandson of Kiyomori, after they had lost their final battle, picked him up, jumped overboard, and they drowned. Another instance in the Tale of Heike, I mentioned Minamoto Yoshinaka, who comes in from the north to Kyoto. He dies in this horrible way in the mud, but his retainer, who's loyal to the end, jumps off his horse onto his sword in his mouth. So there's a variety of very colorful methods. Yeah. So the warrior tales are really wonderfully written. I do think there's some very strong anti-war, very pro-Buddhist stances in there, but they're quite gruesome at times as well. Yes.
This is a little bit unrelated, but we keep on looking at the Edo period, kind of looking back at the Genpei War period, romanticism. But I haven't heard anybody say that they look back at the Warring States period like, oh yeah, that was chaos, good times.
Right. Well, I think that no one wants to return to chaos, and part of Professor Berry's thesis in her book Hideyoshi, which she touched on yesterday, is that it's so awful that they themselves recognize that this is going to be the end of their world if they don't stop. And that's ultimately why they're able to broker peace. But there is some nostalgia for it, that in the same sense that perhaps Western teenagers idolize Bushido and samurai. In Japan, there's definitely a cult of personality for these unifiers, the three unifiers. So Nobunaga, Hideyoshi, and Ieyasu.
There's also a Sengoku boom going on right now in Japanese pop culture. I'm reading a manga where all of the warrior lords, Sengoku, Warring States period, all of the warrior lords are trying to do modern Kojo as his own hotties. Shallow, what can I say? And this is perennially popular in pop culture too. This spring's major historical drama was called Taira no Kiyomori. It's all about him and his,
I've got to watch that.
Yeah.
Yeah, and this becomes really popular in business circles or self-help books. There's these three unifiers supposedly had very different attitudes and strategies. There are a couple sayings about them. So, for instance, when asked, how do you get a bird to sing? Nobunaga says, I'll kill it if it doesn't sing. Hideyoshi says, I'll make it sing. And Ieyasu says, I'll wait until it sings. And so there are these different strategies. Yes?
So I tried to press Professor Berry after the lecture about the standard that we have that says there is a connection between warrior code and the 20th century.
Mm-hmm.
And she would have none of it, but it sounds like you would.
I would say that in terms of there being an actual warrior code, I wouldn't buy it. But I think
if there was in the mind of the Japanese.
Absolutely, I think it becomes a part of the education process in modern Japan. Andrea can speak to this better than I can as a modern historian. But my very strong impression is that this is sort of a part of the indoctrination that you need to die for the emperor. This is loyalty unto death, and certainly Westerners too bought this line, hook, line, and sinker. I think it was 1899. There was a book written, Bushido, the Way of the Warrior, and this is written in English for a Western audience. And this is sort of how Japan's presenting itself to the world: is you guys have chivalry, we have Bushido, and this is the way that Japan will march forward. And that even during the war, the knowledge of Japan was really terrible. So the chrysanthemum and the sword, the outcome of Ruth Benedict's anthropological survey during the war, when she didn't go to Japan or learn to speak Japanese, it's all about duty and obligation and honor. And I think there is a degree of it, but it's largely a misconception. But it's one that the Japanese themselves, to a point, bought into in those pre-war years. Andrew, did you have something to add?
Yeah, I mean, I was actually going to say this tomorrow, but I can say it today. Like, I do think this sort of idea of Bushido as a thing becomes a thing in the Meiji period. It starts in 1868, and then as the government modernizes and decides that militarization and colonization is the path to survival in this sort of imperialized world, they do very much sort of invent this mythology of Bushido and along with several other mythologies about the past.
Right. And it's expanded. It's no longer just samurai that are Bushido. This is now a conscription army. Everyone has Bushido. This is the Japanese spirit now, not the warrior spirit.
Right. And I think the thing to notice too is that like the early wars Japan fought with like actual descendants of samurai families primarily populating the officer class, they were pretty bad tactically. Like they win, but not because they're really good at like what we would consider sort of military skills. It's more,
this is World War I tactics.
Coincidence, yeah.
Wave after wave of their own men.
The Japanese army gets tactically much better when you have, commoner stock essentially at the higher ranks. At the same time, too, that is also the time when you see a lot more atrocities. So, yeah, it's complicated. But yeah, I mean, definitely like this concept of Bushido.
Yeah, there's absolutely a link between the idea of Bushido and wartime Japan, the rise to aggression. However, I don't think that's based in any kind of historical fact. Yes?
In my textbook, I swear there's a connection between Bushido and also the concept of the modern salaryman.
Yeah, they apply, that now this will of the warrior is the will of the businessman, and he is loyal to his company, and it's a lifelong employment. Of course, this has. Yeah, you can't. I would take anything that does anything the will of something with a grain of salt, and anything related to Bushido as well. But especially now, given the way that the lifetime employment system is breaking down, it's clear that this really isn't the case.
And I had to talk about like when the lifetime employment system did work, from like say the 60s through the 90s roughly. Being a salaryman really sucks. Like it really sucks.
And it's at most 20% of the workforce.
That like will make people, take on this terrible life where you get up at 6 and you're out drinking till 2, and then you go back every day. With people that you hate, and you never see your family, and your family doesn't like or need you,
Which part of that was terrible?
I mean, for some people, it's congenial. But I mean, this gets back to what Professor Barchet was saying, that like the medieval might be more human, because in the medieval period you don't have this kind of modernizing.
Right. But you have the constant repurposing of the past, especially warriors, because it's an incredibly romantic past. Much in the same way you can't turn on the TV now and not hear about the founding fathers and what they wanted. It's really easy to take someone that can't speak for themselves and use them for your own argument. And so I think in that sort of way, the warriors and the application of Bushido were used to project modern projects.
Let's take one more question.
Sure.
How can I phrase this? You've mentioned a couple of times there wasn't much bloodshed in this early period, particularly compared with the Warring States era. And you were talking about army size, 700,000 or whatever was the number that Professor Berry came up with at one point. And you also mentioned that the warrior class was less than 1% of the population. So in these battles, let's say at Yashima, is there a sense of how many soldiers were?
I don't know the military history well enough to put a real number on it. I would say it's in the low thousands. This is I know Yoritomo started with a band of about 30. Fought his first battles with about 300. But of course, as he expands and moves westward, more and more people came. But it's also an issue of how you count the army, whether people that are fighting nominally under his banner count as part of it. But I suppose in a specific battle, it'd be easier to figure out. But I would say it's probably in the single thousands.
Okay, thank you very much.
All right, yeah, thank you.